I'd like to pray for guidance in giving this sermon because George actually wrote it and intended to give it, but a mere hour ago or so he called me to let me know he had some car trouble and wouldn't be able to make it. But he was able to email the sermon, and I've got it here, and hopefully this goes well. So the New Testament reading today is from Matthew chapter 6, verses 13 to 20. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. According to the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus had been receiving a rather rough reception from his countrymen around Galilee. He had recently been involved with some controversies with the scribes and the Pharisees, who had taken issue with some of his practices that in their minds weren't hewing closely enough to Jewish tradition. So he leads his disciples into the region of Tyre and Sidon, famous cities in the ancient Near East, located in what is today the country of Lebanon, about 15 miles north of where he'd been preaching in Galilee. Geography matters. These were Roman cities, so Jesus was leading them into what they would have regarded as foreign, even hostile territory, outside of the precincts of where they would have felt at home as Jews. It was here that Jesus healed the Canaanite woman, as described in last week's lectionary reading. And it's here that we get our first inkling that Jesus' ministry is not only for the lost sheep of Israel, but for the whole world. His travels in this region eventually lead him and his followers to the area of Caesarea Philippi, where the discussion in today's reading takes place. It's here that Jesus asks his disciples the question, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" The Son of Man is a term Jesus sometimes applies to himself in the New Testament, but it doesn't really give us much information about who he is. It's just a fancy way of saying, this human being. Who do people say I am? Jesus, in essence, asks. This is not an inconsequential question. The disciples have been following Jesus around the region of Galilee for a while now, and he's led them into Roman territory. He's been performing miracles and preaching enigmatic parables about the kingdom of heaven, attracted a good bit of attention along the way. Who exactly is this guy they're following? What's his game? What are people saying about him? These are pressing questions, but when I read this passage, I have questions of my own. What is this place with the Roman name Caesarea Philippi to which Jesus has led them? And why does he choose it, of all places, to ask his disciples this central question? Like I said, geography matters. The city of Caesarea Philippi lies 35 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, at the foot of Mount Hermon, which separates Syria from Lebanon. It rises to a height of nearly 10,000 feet, making it the tallest mountain in the region, looming over everything in its vicinity. The waters from its slope feed the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea. It's just not any old place. Caesarea Philippi was also the regional headquarters of the Roman Empire. Why has Jesus led his disciples so deeply into imperial territory for such a significant conversation about who he is? But there's more. Caesarea Philippi was also one of the major centers of the Roman religious cult. Start with the name. It was named for Tetrarch Philip and Caesar Augustus, the emperor who during his lifetime was proclaimed Son of God and was elevated to full godhood after his death. It was also home to many temples dedicated to pagan gods, most prominently the fertility god Pan, after whom the city had formerly been named. Representative as half-goat, half-human, Pan's statue had, shall we say, pornographic dimensions. Many of the cults located here would engage in temple prostitution and a host of other practices that Jews found abhorrent. Jesus had in effect taken his disciples into the red light district of their world. No self-respecting Jew would be caught dead near this place, and yet this was where Jesus brought them to ask his question. That can't be without significance. But that's not all. Mount Hermon itself was a sacred place to the Romans, with many niches carved out of the cliffs that bore statues of Greek and Roman gods, not unlike Mount Rushmore. It's this rocky pantheon that Jesus and his disciples are facing when he poses this question. At the bottom, there was a strange water system that ran under the mountain, referred to by the locals as one of the entrances to Hades, the gates of hell. The gods were thought to pass in and out of the underworld there. All sorts of worship of the gods took place here on this rock with the gates of Hades underneath. So Caesarea Philippi was a place of singular religious and political importance. Jesus had taken his disciples far north of Galilee to conduct this important conversation that, as we'll see, challenges the very foundation of the ancient pagan world. It's here, not in Jerusalem, that he asks who the Son of Man is. The answers given by his disciples are all in the ballpark of the ordinary expectations of a Jewish audience. Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Notice that the disciples' answers make no reference to anyone outside the Jewish tradition. That Jesus has taken them to this foreign place with statues of the pagan gods all staring down on them evidently doesn't strike them as relevant. It doesn't seem to occur to them that Jesus may have a reason for asking this question in a setting as far removed from the traditions of Israel as possible. They've given no thought to who the people of Caesarea Philippi might think Jesus is. But what about you, asks Jesus after they've given their answers. I'm not really interested in what others say. I want to hear what you say. You who have been traveling with me all of this time, listening to my preaching and witnessing my deeds. Who do you say I am? Simon Peter speaks up. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. The title Christos, or Christ, is the Greek form of the Jewish term Messiah, which literally means anointed one. Christians today often use the word Christ as just another name for Jesus. Some people even seem to think that it's his last name, with his middle initial being H. But on the lips of most first-century Jews, Christ or Messiah would be more like a job description, albeit a very special one. Many Jews were awaiting a new king in the line of David, someone anointed by God to liberate Israel from the rule of the Romans and establish a new Davidic kingdom. No doubt this kind of messianic deliverance is what many people believe Jesus was promising in his proclamation of the kingdom of heaven. So the first part of Simon Peter's answers, "You're the Messiah," doesn't really say anything outside the ballpark of Jewish expectations at the time. But then he adds, "the Son of the living God." That's something new. Let's turn our attention back to where the conversation is taking place. Simon Peter is making this declaration in the face of a whole panoply of gods carved into the face of Mount Hermon, in a city named after a dead emperor who had also declared himself to be the son of a god. Simon Peter is making a remarkable and even somewhat seditious confession. Here, standing before me, is the real Son of God, and not a dead God like these lifeless statues carved into the mountain, not a God who presides over Hades, the abode of the dead, but a living God, a life-giving God. Geography matters, as Simon Peter seems to have grasped. It's not Caesar, into whose neighborhood they had wandered, but Jesus, who is the real presence of God on earth. And if so, then Jesus matters not just for the Jews, but also for pagans like us, who search for God in strange places, who worship various idols, including but not limited to our political leaders. Jesus commends his disciple for getting it right. Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Simon Bar-Jonah, literally Simon, son of Jonah, Jonah being his father's name. Why is Jesus suddenly addressing him formally? Do you remember the story of Jonah? Jonah was a reluctant prophet sent by God to preach to the non-Jewish city of Nineveh, deep in the territory of one of Israel's historic enemies, and to urge them to repent. But Jonah, who hates the people of Nineveh and would rather see them destroyed by God for their depravity, tries to escape his mission by taking off in the opposite direction. He hasn't gotten very far before being swallowed by a giant fish. After he's vomited out, he resigns himself to his mission and delivers God's message to the people of Nineveh, who then repent, much to Jonah's chagrin. By calling his disciple by his full name, Simon, son of Jonah, Jesus alludes to this well-known story about how God's grace is for all peoples and not just for the Jews. It fits well with the setting in which Jesus has penetrated deep into the territory of Israel's enemy, with the implications being that the good news he brings is for everyone, not just the Jews, not just the righteous. This was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. The insight that Simon Peter has gained is not something he learned from his fellow human beings. It couldn't be, given how parochial and narrow-minded we all tend to be. It's an insight that takes him beyond the horizon of the usual human understanding of things. Jesus continues, "And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." The name Peter, or Petros, which Jesus here confers on his disciple for the first time, literally means rock in Greek. And again, think of the geography. They're facing the massive rock face of Mount Hermon, with all of these pagan gods carved into it, and at its base a spring that the locals call the gates of Hades, the entrance to the underworld. In place of this monument to violent divinities and the cult of death, Jesus lays the foundation of his church, a community of an entirely different sort than the empire of Caesar, a universal community that is built on love rather than violence and fear. Think of how differently Jesus' words would have sounded in Jerusalem or Galilee, in a Jewish setting surrounded by familiar emblems of the worship of Israel's God. It's in this place of moral corruption that he begins the construction of his church. Geography matters. Jesus' choice of his location in the heart of an enemy territory, a place that is the embodiment of everything a right-thinking Jew of the first century would regard as evil and depraved, speaks volumes about the mission of the church. There's a sense in which we all tend to live in a kind of underworld, a Hades of our own construction, due to our patterns of rivalry and resentment, our lack of charity and forgiveness. And there's a sense in which we all tend to worship at the wrong rock, a gallery of idols who stand for our various tribal allegiances and other unworthy preoccupations, the object of our greed and lust and envy. Jesus is not afraid to venture into enemy territory, to meet us at the gate of our own Hades, where we stand facing a wall of our own idols. Love is more powerful than idols of death. Thanks be to George.